Hey y'all, today I'm going to be building something that I've wanted to build for the last couple of years, the open source cart reader. This sick little piece of kit lets me back up pretty much any cartridge-based games. They're save files, and thanks to an N64 Controller Connector, it can even pull saves off of N64 memory cards. It's also highly extensible, with lots of community-made adapters for other game systems. I'm building mine with the default Game Boy and 6-slot connector, so that covers N64, NES, Famicom, SNES, Super Famicom, Mega Drive/Genesis, and the Master System. This build requires a lot of soldering and a lot of parts, so the full list will be linked below, along with the GitHub and all the instructions and everything else you need. The parts you see here are only for the main board with the Game Boy adapter, so keep that in mind, but essentially what you need to build it is a number of replacement cartridge slots, pin headers, capacitors, switches, a clone board of an Arduino ATMega2560, and a commonly used LCD screen for 3D printers. The only other things you need are some custom PCBs that you can get manufactured online. I used JLC PCB because it ended up being a bit cheaper, but I heard PCBWay is also really good. Okay, with the parts out of the way, I'm going to get started by flashing the Arduino to make sure it's fully functional before I modify it for this build. Essentially, once the Arduino board is modified, it'll no longer turn on without being connected to the cart reader, so testing it beforehand is really important. To flash the Arduino, I start by downloading the latest version of the release from the cart reader GitHub. The very first thing I need to do is make sure to install the CH341 drivers, which are included. Then I'll open up the Arduino IDE, which is also included. And finally open up the cart reader sketchbook in the IDE. Next I need to update the config and select the hardware revision I'm using and which modules I'll be installing. This includes things like the clock generator circuit and which cartridge types I expect to be able to dump. Turning things on is as easy as removing the comment from the beginning of the line. I'm using pretty much default config, so I don't really need to actually change anything, but it's always good to double check. Next, I'll choose which COM port to communicate on, based on what I see in my device manager on Windows. In my case, it's COM3. Yours could be different. Now I'll program the Arduino by selecting the sketch menu and clicking Upload. Then I just wait until it's done. Finally, while I'm here, I'm going to copy over the contents of the SD card folder into the SD card that I'll be using, and marking the game DBs as hidden. You don't need all of those files, you can just take the ones for the consoles you intend to use, but they're fairly small, so I didn't bother filtering them. Now I'm going to start soldering the main PCB. I'm starting with the Game Boy slot. It's a lot of fine soldering, so I'd recommend solder paste, but I don't have any, so I'm just going to do it by hand with a soldering iron. I also lost the footage here, so this is a reflow solder instead of the original, but it's basically the same. Since I've chosen not to use the automated voltage selection circuit, I'll add the LED and resistor to show when the power's on. Yes, for some reason, these are mutually exclusive. Next, I'll solder on the two switches. One is for turning on the whole board, and the other one is for selecting between 5V or 3.3 volt, which is necessary depending on what you're trying to dump. For example, Game Boy Advance games require the 3V, whereas Game Boy games require 5. Now I'll add the connectors for the LCD screen, making sure to align the notches where the PCB shows the little notch cutouts. Next, I'll attach the long female headers, so that's a 38 and a 36 pin. I had to cut down some 40 pin ones, which is pretty easy, but you just remove the pin next to the last pin you need, and then break it with a pair of pliers, or use a little saw or rotary tool or whatever to cut it to size. The main thing is you want to shorten the header so it fits within the space that you have. Or just buy the appropriate size headers if you can find them. After that, I want to solder on the 7-pin header for the clock circuit. Now I'll solder on the female headers for all the Arduino connections. Here you can see what the board looks like with all the headers in place. Last thing to add is the VCC wire that's going to connect power to the Arduino. Or rather from the Arduino. I left it long to start, and I'll shorten it once I know how much slack I'll need. Alright, now I'm going to move on to the Arduino, and I'm just going to solder the male headers on. A nice trick for keeping things straight is to connect the headers into a breadboard, and then place the Arduino on top and solder it in place. Once I've got all those in place, I'll just do a quick test fit to make sure all the pins are aligned with the headers and get everything in place. If anything's not aligned, it's easy enough to get them as close as possible, then heat up the solder on the pins so they can wiggle a little bit and line themselves up. With the headers on, next I'm going to do one modification to the Arduino, which is removing this tiny fuse. The way I'm doing it here is actually not how I'd recommend doing it, since I ended up pulling off one of the pads, but luckily it wasn't the one I needed to reuse. So if you're going to try this, I'd suggest adding a bit of fresh solder to both ends of the fuse and then kind of rubbing the soldering tip back and forth on top of it while applying very gentle pressure from some tweezers, and it should slide right off. Now I'm going to attach the VCC wire from the main board to the Arduino where the fuse was. I'm going to use the pad closest to the USB port, since that will allow me to reroute power from the USB port to the main board, bypassing the Arduino entirely. This is important because we're going to use the LCD's voltage regulator to step down from 5 to 3.3 volt when needed, and ensure power is routed properly through everything, and then back to the Arduino. Alright, with that done, I'm going to get the clock circuit set up. All I need to do here is solder on the male headers. Next, I'll solder on the capacitor on the main board. It's polarized, so just make sure you know which side is ground, and the ground side will be in the square pad, whereas the non-ground side will be in the circular pad. Ground is usually the one with the white line down the cap. Now it's time to modify the LCD. This one's super easy. There's a couple of pads that look like they're missing a component, so all I'm going to do is bridge those two pads with a little bit of solder. This just makes sure power can flow through the whole system. Okay. Now I'm going to test the board in this state, so I need to insert the prepared SD card into my LCD module, then connect the EXP1 and EXP2 ribbon cables to the appropriate places on the mainboard and LCD. With those connected the right way around, I should be able to plug in a USB cable to the Arduino and see something happen. This is actually where I ran into the first problem with this build. Something happened to the Arduino and I ended up having to replace it. So this is technically a different Arduino than you saw a second ago. But now you can see it's booted up. I've popped in a Game Boy game, and if I select Game Boy from the menu, then I'm going to attempt to read the ROM, and it should save it to the SD card. I actually decided to test more than just one game, so now I'm going to use a Game Boy Color game, then a Game Boy Advance game, and basically before I moved on I had backed up my entire Game Boy collection, or at least a good chunk of it, which you can see right here. Alright, so now that we know it works, it's time to move on to all of the remaining soldering. This is the 6-slot adapter board. It has slots for the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, the NES, the Famicom, the Master System, the Mega Drive or Genesis, and the N64. I also need to attach a couple more headers so I can interface with the main board, and I need to attach a header so I can connect the Super Nintendo CIC circuit once I've got that soldered up. I'm going to start by soldering in the Super Nintendo slot, and basically I'm going to work my way out from the center from there so I can solder things in without the things I've already soldered getting in the way. After I have the SNES slot soldered on, I'm going to move to the 8-slot female header for the CIC chip, then the 1K resistor for the N64 controller port, and finally the 2 extra long male headers that will connect to the main board. While I'm soldering, I'll mention a few things. First off, the clock generator chip is only necessary for certain cartridge types, which is explained on the wiki, so double check if you need it if you're going to follow along, because it's just extra stuff to buy. And the same goes for the CIC chip. It's only required for certain SNES games. So again, if you need it, get it. If you don't, you can skip it. Just make sure you update your config. Okay, next I'll do the N64 slot, then the Famicom slot, NES slot, Genesis, and Master System slots. I'm basically going from the center out to one edge, then flipping the board around and doing the same thing towards the other edge. The order here really doesn't matter as long as you're able to get things soldered in. Now that I've got all the cartridge slots soldered on, I'm going to solder up the CIC circuit. It just requires adding the 8-pin male header, soldering in a small ceramic capacitor, and then soldering on the pre-programmed CIC chip. Now this is one of the PCBs I had to get custom printed as well, so just keep that in mind. Next up, I should attach the N64 Controller Connector like you see here, but I kind of jumped ahead because I tried using an existing extension cable and it didn't work out with the case I printed, so I had to pull it off and start over. So just as I'm working on the rest of it, you might see different controller ports depending on what I'm doing next, but either way, it should be set up like follows. Just like in my N64 Pico controller adapter video, I'll wire up the port the exact same way. So VCC is the leftmost port when you're looking into it and it's oriented properly. Data is the middle pin, and ground is the rightmost pin. I'm using 3 separate wires, red for power, blue for data, black for ground, and using some heat shrink to hold them all together to make it a bit easier to work with. After soldering the connector onto the wires and having the wires soldered to the board, I'm happy to finally test it. I'm going to quickly connect the 2 boards by inserting the male headers from the 6-slot board into the female headers on the main board after reconnecting the LCD ribbon cables. Now I'm just going to run the self-test to check for any bridge connections. Make sure you're using the right voltage setting if you're following along, because setting the wrong voltage can fry things. Now I'm going to get started on the case, which my friend 3D printed for me. It's the model from Kaitor Industries, which you can find online and link below. First thing to do is add some heat set inserts to hold in the screws. Now these are for M2 screws, and I'm going to be adding them to hold the LCD in place. Next, I'll screw in the LCD using some M2 screws with nylon washers. Now I'm going to start assembling the main part of the case. The first thing you should do is attach a screw with one of the mounting posts or spacers or whatever you want to call them in where it will pass through the Arduino PCB. This one's not accessible from outside the case, and I found that out the hard way by having to tear the whole thing down again. After that, it's just a lot of screwing. Hold the spacer in the appropriate place and the screw in from behind, and just make sure there's a washer between the spacer and the PCB so that it doesn't scratch it up. With the main board in place, next I'll run all the wires. The N64 Controller Connector has to run kind of between the 2 LCD ribbon cables, and honestly the cables are pretty long, so off camera I trimmed them and added new connectors. You don't have to do this, you can just stuff the excess cable into the little cavity under the screen, but I thought it looked nicer and it was easier to work with. Next I'll attach the 6-slot PCB board to the main board, making sure all the pins on the male headers firmly seat into the female headers on the main board. Now I'll attach the N64 connector to the case and close it up. Then I'll screw in the front panel with the LCD from below. And finally, the top screws that go into the 6-slot PCB. Again, using washers to protect everything from scratching. Which isn't totally necessary, but I wanted to do it. Okay, the last thing is to just click into place the cartridge slot identifiers. And then I can pop on the top cover. And it's fully assembled. With it fully assembled, I'll run another self-test just to make sure I didn't short something while I was fiddling around or when I cut the display cables. Alright, that seems to have worked. Finally, to prevent some scratches from the little screws in case they pop out a little bit, I'm just going to add some little rubber bumper feet, and we can move on to seeing the finished product. case you're wondering what it looks like once you've dumped the files, here's the folder structure on mine. I dumped some Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, N64, NES, and SNES games. They all end up in their own folders, and when you click through, you can see each one has its own separate folder with each attempt at reading a ROM or save file. That's it for me. I'm going to go back up the rest of my games now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next one.